In moments of crisis, power doesn't disappear. It concentrates. March 2020 is remembered as a health crisis. Lockdowns, empty streets, panic headlines. Markets collapsed faster than at any point in modern history. Trillions of dollars vanished in weeks. But while most people were focused on survival, something far more important happened quietly behind closed doors. For the first time in history, the U.S. Federal Reserve crossed a line that had never been crossed before. It announced it would begin buying corporate bonds. Not government debt. Not emergency relief for citizens. Corporate debt. This wasn't just a market intervention. It was a structural shift. Because when a central bank steps in to support private corporations, it is no longer just stabilizing markets. It is deciding who survives and who doesn't. But here's the part almost nobody noticed. The Federal Reserve didn't execute this program itself. Instead, it outsourced the decision-making. One private firm was given the authority to choose which companies would be supported, which bonds would be bought, and which markets would be stabilized. A firm whose decisions would ripple across the global financial system. And that firm did the job for free. No fees. No commission. $0. In finance, nothing is free. When a company managing trillions of dollars offers to work for nothing, it's not charity. It's strategy. Because what they received in return wasn't money. It was something far more valuable. Influence. And a seat at the control panel of the global economy. This moment didn't create a new system. It revealed one that already existed. For decades, we've been told we live in a free market. That competition drives innovation. That ownership creates independence. That capitalism rewards effort. But what if that story is outdated? What if the real shift already happened? Not suddenly, not violently, but slowly, invisibly? What if ownership itself is being phased out? Look around. You don't really own your music anymore. You stream it. You don't own your software. You subscribe to it. You don't own movies, books, or games. You rent access. Now the same logic is being applied to the most important assets of all. Homes, stocks, infrastructure, even decision-making power. This isn't about one company being evil. This is about incentives. In a system where managing assets is more profitable than owning them, control becomes more important than property. Influence becomes more important than competition. And scale becomes everything. A handful of institutions now sit at the center of global finance, quietly shaping outcomes without ever needing to give direct orders. They don't have to tell markets what to do. Markets move because the system is built that way. And most people don't see it. They still believe they're participating in capitalism, when in reality the rules are changing underneath them. What's emerging looks like capitalism on the surface. But it functions very differently. In this system, individuals don't accumulate assets. They rent access to assets owned by institutions. You don't build wealth through ownership. You become a long-term customer. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a structural transformation. And it's happening quietly enough that by the time most people realize what changed, ownership itself may already be out of reach. This is the story of that transformation. How it started, who benefits, and why the idea of you'll own nothing isn't a prediction, it's a business model. And it all leads back to one uncomfortable question. If markets are no longer truly free, who is really in control? To understand how power really works today, you have to unlearn something fundamental. We're taught to think that the most powerful players are the ones who own the most assets. Factories, companies, real estate, resources. But ownership is no longer where the real power is. The real power is in management, in deciding how assets are priced, how risk is measured, how capital flows, and when it stops. That's the insight that reshaped modern finance. Because if you manage other people's assets, you don't need to take risks yourself. You collect fees regardless of outcomes. You influence decisions without appearing to control them. And most importantly, you shape the system that determines value itself. This is where BlackRock enters the picture. On paper, BlackRock is an asset manager. It manages other people's money, pensions, retirement accounts, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds. As of the mid-2020s, it manages more than $10 trillion in assets. That number alone is hard to comprehend. It's larger than the GDP of almost every country on Earth. But even that figure is misleading. Because BlackRock's true influence extends far beyond the assets it officially manages. What makes it different isn't just size. It's position. BlackRock doesn't sit on the edge of the system, competing like everyone else. It sits at the center. It owns significant stakes in nearly every major publicly traded corporation. Technology, finance, energy, healthcare, media. Not because it wants to control these companies directly, but because being everywhere gives it leverage everywhere. When you are a top shareholder in competing firms within the same industry, competition becomes less important than stability. Price wars stop making sense. Aggressive innovation becomes a risk. The incentive shifts. Instead of asking, how do we beat our competitors? The question becomes, how do we maximize returns across the entire sector? That's not capitalism as most people understand it. It's coordination without explicit coordination. And it doesn't require secret meetings or illegal agreements. It's built directly into the ownership structure. But ownership is only part of the story. The deeper layer, the part almost nobody sees, is infrastructure. Modern finance runs on models, on forecasts, on risk simulations. And over the past few decades, one system has quietly become the default lens through which global risk is measured. Banks use it. Insurance companies use it. Pension funds use it. Governments use it. When institutions representing tens of trillions of dollars all rely on the same framework to define risk, they begin to act in sync, even if they believe they are acting independently. They see the same dangers. They respond in the same way. They buy and sell at the same time. What looks like market consensus is often just shared software. This is how influence works in the modern era. Not through commands but through standards. Not through force but through defaults. And once you become the default, you don't need to persuade anyone anymore. The system does the work for you. This is why BlackRock isn't just another financial firm. It's not even just a large one. It's an operating layer beneath the market itself. And when crises hit, real crises, governments don't turn to academics or think tanks. They turn to whoever understands the system well enough to stabilize it. Which brings us to the moments when this invisible power became impossible to ignore. Moments when private infrastructure and public authority quietly merged. Moments when emergency decisions reshaped the rules of the game. That's what we'll look at next. Modern markets don't move because people panic. They panic because markets move. That's an important distinction. For most of financial history, decisions were slow. Traders reacted to news. Investors interpreted data differently. Markets disagreed with themselves. That friction created volatility, but it also created resilience. Today, friction is disappearing. Because decisions are no longer made primarily by humans. They're made by systems. At the center of this shift is risk management. Every large institution asks the same questions. What do we own? How exposed are we? What happens if rates rise, if prices fall, if liquidity disappears? The problem is not asking these questions. The problem is when everyone gets the same answers. Over time, a single risk framework became dominant. Not because it was mandated, but because it was convenient, trusted, and already integrated everywhere. When hundreds of institutions, controlling tens of trillions of dollars, rely on the same models, markets stop behaving like independent actors. They begin to move as one organism. This is how crashes accelerate. Everyone sees the same risk spike. Everyone sells the same assets. Liquidity vanishes. Prices collapse faster than human psychology alone could explain. And then something else happens. When the signal flips, everyone buys back in, simultaneously. This is not market wisdom. It's algorithmic synchronization. What looks like recovery is often just coordinated repositioning. Now layer ETFs on top of this system. Exchange-traded funds were sold as democratization. Low fees. Instant diversification. Effortless investing. And for individuals, that's largely true. But structurally, ETFs concentrate power. When you buy an ETF, you don't own the underlying companies in any meaningful sense. You own a claim. The voting rights, the influence, are exercised by the fund provider. Millions of passive investors hand over decision-making power without realizing it. The result is quiet consolidation. A small number of firms now vote shares across thousands of companies. They don't need to micromanage. They just need to signal priorities. Executive compensation. Board appointments. Strategic direction. No public debate. No elections. No accountability. And because ETFs hold everything, exiting the system isn't easy. If you sell, you don't punish bad actors. You just reduce your own exposure. So the incentives change. Companies stop optimizing for customers or workers. They optimize for large, permanent shareholders whose capital never leaves. Stability over disruption. Predictability over innovation. Coordination over competition. This is why industries start to feel stagnant. Prices rise together. Wages lag. Products converge. It's not that executives are colluding in smoke-filled rooms. They don't have to. The ownership structure already aligns them. And the risk models reinforce the behavior. Anything that disrupts the system, aggressive competition, radical innovation, price wars, is flagged as dangerous, risky, unacceptable. So the system learns to avoid it. Over time, markets don't just respond to reality. They shape it. Which brings us to the moment when this private machine and public authority became indistinguishable. Because once governments started relying on the same infrastructure to manage crises, the balance of power shifted permanently. And that shift was never reversed. That's where we're going next. Crises don't create new power structures. They expose the ones already in place. The financial system learned this lesson in 2008. When major institutions began to collapse, governments faced a problem they weren't equipped to solve. The assets were too complex. The risks were too interconnected. The data was fragmented. So they turned to those who already understood the machinery. Not to regulate it, but to operate it. Private firms were brought in to value toxic assets, unwind failing portfolios and stabilize markets. This was framed as temporary, an emergency measure. But emergencies have a habit of becoming permanent. By the time the next crisis arrived, the roles were already defined. In March 2020, markets didn't just fall, they seized up. Liquidity vanished. Credit froze. And once again the government stepped in. But this time the intervention went further. Buying corporate bonds meant something profound had changed. The state was no longer just backstopping the system. It was actively shaping it. Which companies would be saved? Which would fail? Which sectors would be stabilized first? These were no longer market outcomes. They were administrative decisions. And they were outsourced. A private asset manager was given the authority to execute one of the largest interventions in financial history. To select assets. To manage portfolios. To deploy public power using private infrastructure. All without charging a fee. The justification was efficiency, speed, expertise. And on the surface it worked. Markets recovered at record pace. Asset prices surged. Financial stability returned. But stability for whom? The intervention didn't save small businesses. It didn't protect wages. It didn't restore ownership. It stabilized asset prices, the assets already owned by institutions. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. No envelopes. No bribes. It was something more subtle. A convergence of incentives. When a firm owns everything, any broad intervention will benefit it. When it manages everything, any crisis becomes an opportunity to entrench its role. Conflict of interest becomes meaningless, not because it disappears but because it becomes universal. From that point on, the distinction between state power and market power began to blur. Former executives moved into government. Former regulators moved into finance. Policy didn't need to be dictated. It was pre-aligned. The system no longer asked whether decisions served the public or private interest, because those interests had been merged at the institutional level. And once that happens, there is no obvious lever to pull. No villain to remove. No single law to change. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Which is why the most dramatic transformation didn't happen in markets or governments. It happened somewhere far more personal. In housing. In ownership. In the basic ability to build a life independent of institutions. That's where the consequences stopped being abstract. And became impossible to ignore. For years the changes we've talked about felt distant. Technical. Abstract. Trillions of dollars. Risk models. Asset managers. Easy to ignore. But after 2020, the consequences moved out of spreadsheets and into neighborhoods. Quietly. Methodically. Housing was the turning point. For most of modern history, home ownership was the foundation of middle-class wealth. You worked. You saved. You bought a home. And over time, that asset gave you stability, leverage, and independence. That model depended on one assumption. That individuals were competing primarily with other individuals. That assumption no longer holds. After the 2020 crisis, capital flooded into hard assets. Interest rates collapsed. Liquidity exploded. And institutional investors went shopping. Not for luxury properties. Not for office towers. For single-family homes. Entire neighborhoods were purchased at scale. Not to flip. Not to sell. To rent, permanently. Algorithms with instant financing began outbidding families who needed mortgages. Cash offers closed in days. Sometimes hours. To the market, these weren't homes. They were yield-generating units. And once enough homes in an area are owned by the same type of buyer, something changes. Rents stop being local. They become systemic. Prices rise together. Terms converge. Mobility disappears. You can move, but you can't escape the system. This wasn't a side effect. It was a feature. Housing had been transformed into an asset class, just like stocks or bonds. Bundled, securitized, optimized, and the people living inside those assets became revenue streams. The same logic applied elsewhere. Why encourage people to own stocks directly when passive funds are easier? Why deal with millions of individual shareholders when a few institutional managers can vote on their behalf? Ownership became inconvenient. Access became the product. This is where the phrase "you'll own nothing" stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like a roadmap. Not because someone announced it, but because the incentives point in one direction. Owning assets ties up capital. Managing assets scales infinitely. So the system nudges people away from ownership and toward participation. You don't own the house. You subscribe to housing. You don't own the business. You own a claim on a fund that owns a claim. You don't make decisions. They're made upstream, by institutions optimizing portfolios, not lives. This is why the comparison to feudalism keeps resurfacing. Not medieval feudalism with castles and titles, but a modern version, where most people don't own productive assets. They pay ongoing rents for access to assets owned by a concentrated elite. The lords aren't individuals. They're institutions. Global, abstract, unaccountable. And unlike traditional landlords, they don't need to negotiate. Their power comes from scale. At this stage, the system doesn't need force. It doesn't need persuasion. It just needs time. Because each generation grows up with less expectation of ownership than the last. What once felt temporary starts to feel normal. And that normalization is the most powerful mechanism of all. Which brings us to the final question. If this system keeps expanding, beyond housing, beyond markets, what happens when it reaches the things we can't live without? That's the endgame. And that's where we're going next. Housing was only the beginning. Once ownership is normalized as unnecessary, every essential system becomes a target. Infrastructure, energy, water, transportation, data. The things you don't notice until they stop working. For governments, the logic is simple. Public debt is exploding. Pension obligations are unfunded. Budgets are strained. Selling infrastructure is framed as modernization. Efficiency. Unlocking value. But value for whom? When public assets are sold, the money is received once. The revenue is lost forever. Citizens don't stop paying, they just start paying rent instead of taxes. And unlike taxes, rent only moves in one direction. This is how access to civilization itself becomes financialized. You don't just rent your home. You rent the road to work, the electricity powering your house, the water you drink, the networks that connect you to everything else. At that point, opting out is impossible. This is why the system doesn't need to be hidden. It doesn't need secrecy. It only needs complexity. Most people aren't excluded by force. They're excluded by design. The rules aren't written against them. They're written without them. And the system rewards those who already own assets with more control, more influence, and more insulation from risk. The winners are clear. Large institutions, asset managers, funds that collect returns without exposure. The losers are quieter. Anyone who expected ownership to mean independence. Anyone who believed saving and working would eventually lead to control over their future. Anyone who assumed capitalism was still about building, not renting. This is why this isn't a conspiracy theory. No secret meetings are required. No grand plan needs to be announced. It's simply what happens when scale, technology, and incentives align. The system is rational, efficient, and deeply indifferent to individuals. That's what makes it dangerous. Because systems like this don't collapse dramatically. They solidify. By the time people realize what they've lost, it no longer feels like something that can be regained. Ownership doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes, quietly, one asset class at a time. And when the shift is complete, the new reality feels permanent, normal, inevitable. The question isn't whether this system exists. It's whether enough people understand it while there's still room to change it. Because awareness is the only thing that introduces friction into a frictionless machine. That's why conversations like this matter. That's why archives matter. If you want to understand how finance, power, and incentives actually shape the world, not how they're explained in headlines but how they work underneath, subscribe to Finance Archives. This channel exists to document what's happening now, before it gets rewritten as how it was always meant to be. Because the future isn't decided by those who react last. It's shaped by those who notice first.